The parish green of Flaxborough, on most nights, was a place where nothing in particular happened. It belonged to that sleepy category of English commons where the grass grew evenly. The benches stood at right angles to nothing in particular, and the most exciting event was the annual appearance of the council's temporary bunting, a venture always, met with polite bafflement about whether it was really necessary. But on the night of the parish illumination evening, something curious disturbed the town's well-trained indifference. Shortly after 11, when the last of the fairy lights had been unplugged and the volunteers trudged home with paper lanterns drooping from their hands, Mrs. Glossop, widow, deaconess, and self-appointed guardian of moral standards, saw what she later described as a moving brightness of uncertain character. Standing at her bedroom window, she watched it cross the parish green from east to west, pausing once near the stone cross and vanishing behind the vestry wall. The light moved neither like a torch nor a candle, more as if someone were carrying a small electric lamp wrapped in a handkerchief. By morning, Mrs. Glossop's account had been repeated, revised, and embroidered until the town's collective imagination had produced a tableau worthy of melodrama. Mysterious footsteps, a midnight visitor to the church, a secret tryst, or possibly, depending on the listener, the restless soul of Canon Bream, whose sermons had been long and whose afterlife, one hoped, would be shorter. The discovery that followed only added kindling to the speculation. At 7:30 the next morning, Mr. Pedder, the churchwarden, came striding across the green to unlock the vestry. His routine was as fixed as the bells themselves, 7:30 without fail, except in cases of flood or funeral. He was, therefore, both irritated and bewildered to find, neatly placed outside the vestry door, a pair of men's shoes, brown leather brogues damp with dew, standing side by side as if their owner had stepped out of them mid-prayer. Pedder examined them with the disapproval of a man who has encountered something outside the bylaws. They were of respectable make, Russell and Hall by the look of them, and no mud on the soles to suggest indecency. He touched them cautiously with his umbrella, then looked around the green, which remained obstinately empty. By 8 o'clock, 3 members of the parish council had been informed, 2 of whom arrived to give contradictory opinions about the shoe's origin, and by 9, the matter had reached the desk of Inspector Purbright at Flaxborough Police Station. Purbright, who had been halfway through his first cup of tea, received the news with a mild expression that could have meant anything from amusement to reflux. "Brown brogues, you say?" he asked Sergeant Love, who was reading the report aloud. "Yes, sir. Size 9, according to the churchwarden. Damp, but otherwise undamaged. Left outside the vestry, and no note or anything. The vicar claims they're not his, and no parishioner admits to missing a pair." Purbright nodded thoughtfully, as if such footwear phenomena were part of his usual caseload. "And no footprints leading away?" "Apparently not. Just a few marks in the grass where they stood." "Pedder says they looked placed with intention." Purbright's lips twitched. "That does sound very like Mr. Pedder." He set down his cup, stood, and reached for his coat, the sort of slow, deliberate movement that suggested he was merely humouring the situation rather than rushing to investigate a crime. "Come along." "Love, let us view these ecclesiastical relics before someone claims they're miraculous." The parish green, when they arrived, had already become a kind of open-air committee meeting. Mrs. Glossop was in attendance, of course, along with Mrs. Hobbs from the vicarage, and a couple of idle tradesmen pretending to have urgent reasons to pass by. The shoes, placed under a newspaper by Pedder to preserve evidence from sunlight, sat like sacred relics on the vestry steps. Purbright examined them without touching. "A tidy pair," he murmured. "Rather conscientious, whoever arranged them." Pedder, frowning, shifted from one foot to the other. "It's not decent, Inspector." "Not decent at all. People shouldn't be wandering barefoot about the Lord's property in the middle of the night." "Perhaps they were struck by sudden reverence," said Purbright. One hears of conversions beginning with the removal of shoes. Mrs. Glossop sniffed audibly. If you ask me, Inspector, this town's full of converts of the wrong sort. I saw a light moving across this very green. Unnatural, I thought it. Like someone trying not to be seen. Purbright inclined his head with grave courtesy. You're quite certain it wasn't simply someone searching for their way home? I know the difference between a sinner and a late sleeper.
Inspector, she replied. Purbright said nothing.
But the faintest glimmer of amusement appeared in his eyes. The kind of humour reserved for moments when human behaviour exceeded his capacity for logic. As he and Love walked back across the green, the morning sun drying the grass behind them, Purbright said quietly, "It's curious, Love, how swiftly a pair of shoes can become a moral issue." "Yes, sir." "Do you think it's anything serious?" Purbright's gaze lingered on the church tower. "That rather depends, Sergeant, on what else those shoes were meant to walk away from." By the following morning, the matter of the mysterious shoes had settled over Flaxborough like a fine drizzle, impossible to ignore, faintly irritating and sustained chiefly by repetition. In every grocer's queue and post office line, one could hear a variant of the same account, improved slightly in each telling. What had begun as a quiet peculiarity outside the vestry now marched briskly through the imaginations of the town's more articulate residents. Mrs. Glossop, secure in her position as the original witness, had already composed a statement for the Parish magazine. An unaccountable luminescence on the green, she had titled it, with the sort of solemn grandeur usually reserved for acts of God or council resolutions. The editor, who was also the choirmaster, tried suggesting that odd light might be a less provocative phrase. Mrs. Glossop replied that it was her duty as a Christian to warn the parish against nocturnal wandering, spectral or otherwise. By mid-morning, Inspector Purbright's phone had rung 3 times, none of the calls bearing new information, but all offering opinions. One from Councillor Turnbull, who feared vandalism, another from Mrs. Maybury of the WI, who feared communists, and a third from the vicar himself, who feared that the diocesan newsletter might get wind of it. Purbright listened with unfailing courtesy, his pencil idly circling a teacup stain on his blotter. "Quite so, Reverend," he murmured. "Yes, indeed, most inconvenient for your newsletter."
No, I shouldn't think the supernatural is a police matter.
Though I dare say the paperwork would be simpler. When he finally replaced the receiver, Sergeant Love stood in the doorway, notebook in hand and expression cautiously hopeful.
"Sir, I've been round to the vicarage again."
"The shoes belong to a Mr. Osbert Cleeve."
"Lives on Church Lane, just beyond the butcher's." "Ah, the treasurer of the Illumination Committee." Purbright leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly.
"And has he, by chance, reappeared along with his footwear?" "Not yet, sir. Mrs. Cleeve says he went out after supper to check on something at the Green and never came back. She thought he'd stayed the night at his brother's in Gainsborough, but he hasn't." Purbright stood, stretching his shoulders as though limbering for a stroll rather than an investigation. "Then let's inquire whether Mr. Cleeve's devotion to parish lighting extended to wandering about shoeless in the dark." The Cleeve house proved to be one of those modest, square dwellings that seemed permanently surprised to find themselves detached. The curtains were of heavy brocade, drawn to half-mast as if in mourning for better taste. Mrs. Cleeve, a small, sharp-featured woman with eyes that blinked rather than wept, greeted them with the faint defensiveness of one unused to visitors before noon. "I don't understand it."
"Inspector," she began, ushering them into a sitting room fragrant with furniture polish.
"Osbert's never stayed out a night in his life, except once in '58, when the train broke down outside Lincoln." Purbright nodded gently. "Your husband seemed preoccupied, perhaps. The preparations for the event?" She hesitated. "Well, he's been—"
"Worried, I suppose."
"The accounts. Something about the invoices not matching up. He said it was only a matter of timing, but—" She paused, folding a handkerchief with exacting precision. "People can be unkind, Inspector. They notice things. Indeed they do. said Purbright softly, particularly when there's nothing better to notice. Sergeant Love, who lacked his superior's subtlety, cleared his throat. Did he mention meeting anyone, ma'am? Only Mr. Hobson from the lighting firm. They had words last week about a bill, but surely that's just business. Purbright thanked her, assured her that her husband was likely merely sorting something out, and took his leave. Outside on the narrow pavement, Love frowned.
You think he's done a bunk, sir?
Purbright's eyes followed the slow drift of a milk float down the lane. A bunk sergeant suggests purpose. I rather think Mr. Cleeve may have wandered into something less organised. That afternoon, as the constables combed the green and the vicar rehearsed a statement to appease his congregation, the parish magazine proofs reached the printing office. The headline, Mysterious Manifestation on Sacred Ground, promised more than the facts could deliver, but then so did most things in Flaxborough. By dusk, Mrs. Glossop's article had been discussed at the Green Man Inn, the station platform, and at least 2 hairdressers. Some claimed Cleeve had eloped, others that he'd been seen barefoot on the towpath, and one man swore he'd been taken up by aliens, though his wife quickly reminded him that aliens had no business in Lincolnshire. When Purbright returned to the station, he found a telegram on his desk. Cleeve, not with Brother Stop, has not been seen since Tuesday Stop. He read it twice, folded it neatly, and slid it into his drawer. Love, he said, we may have to decide whether we're looking for a man or merely his reputation. The sergeant scratched his head. And what's the difference, sir? About 2 days of gossip, said Purbright outside. The lamps along the parish green flickered on, one after another, until the whole square glowed with the same soft light that had drawn Mrs. Glossop's attention the night before. It seemed to Purbright, watching from the station window, that the town itself was blinking uncertainly, half in brightness, half in shadow, waiting to see which would win. Inspector Purbright's notion of progress was never hurried. He preferred to let matters ripen of their own accord, believing, with good reason, that truth often emerged not from pursuit, but from patience. By the morning after Mrs. Cleeve's interview, the town's appetite for speculation had grown pleasantly plump. Everyone had an opinion, few had facts, and Purbright, seated at his desk with a small notebook open before him, intended to preserve that distinction as long as possible. He began his inquiries in the most unobtrusive manner by calling upon the Reverend Carling, vicar of St. Swithin's and reluctant custodian of the vanished treasurer's affairs. Carling was a tall, mild man whose faith seemed chiefly exercised in the hope that nobody would make a scene. He greeted Purbright with the faint air of someone braced for confession, though uncertain whether he was priest or penitent. "My dear Inspector," he began, offering a hand as soft and cool as sermon paper, "this whole business is most distressing. I do hope it's a misunderstanding." "I've a feeling it is, Reverend," Purbright said amiably, settling himself in the vicar's armchair. "Most things are once properly misunderstood." The vicar blinked, uncertain whether agreement was expected. "You'll want to know about the accounts, I suppose. Osbert was most particular, meticulous to the point of scruple. He said only last week that we'd come out nearly even." "Nearly?" Purbright's tone carried polite curiosity rather than challenge. Carling hesitated, tugging at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Well, there was a minor discrepancy, a small one. He said he'd advance the difference himself until the donations cleared." "And did they?" The vicar's eyes shifted toward the window, where the parish green glowed faintly under cloud. "Not that I know of. But one hesitates to pry into another man's ledgers," Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "An admirable sentiment in a vicar, though less so in a treasurer." He left Carling's study a quarter hour later, his expression unchanged, but his eyes faintly sharpened. As he and Sergeant Love crossed the churchyard, the wind teased at the yellowing notices on the board: harvest festival supper, choir practice, appeal for new kneelers. Life in Flaxborough, as ever, continued in tidy rectangles. Their next call took them to the Green Man Inn, a low, timbered building with a reputation for hearing more confessions than the church itself. The landlord, Mr. Copping, had a voice that implied years of adjudicating darts matches and marital quarrels with equal patience. "Evening, Inspector. You'll be after Cleve, I suppose?"
Sat right there last Thursday, he did.
"Pint of mild and a pencil behind his ear, writing sums on a beer mat." Purbright regarded the stool with mild reverence. An unorthodox bookkeeping arrangement, though possibly more accurate than most. Copping chuckled. "Said he was sorting out the lighting bill. Looked a bit down, truth be told. I asked if he was all right, and he just said, 'It'll come clear after dark.' I thought he meant the accounts, you see." Love frowned.
Did he leave alone?
"Far as I know. Mrs. Dacre from the shop came in just after he went. Said she saw him crossing the green. That was about 9:30. When they left the pub, Purbright paused outside, his gaze tracing the row of dimly glowing street lamps. "You notice, love, how every statement seems to include a light of some kind?" "Now you mention it, sir, yes. Do you think it's important?" Purbright's mouth curved slightly. "I think it's illuminating." They proceeded to the council offices, a brick edifice whose architecture suggested the joint efforts of civic pride and chronic indecision. The clerk, a brisk woman named Miss Baines, greeted them with a look that managed to combine curiosity with annoyance, qualities not uncommon in public service. "Mr. Cleve handled most of the parish accounts," she said crisply.
Always on time, always exact.
"Though I did think him a little, secretive. He liked to bring papers home rather than use the office ledger. Said he worked better alone." "Did he mention any trouble with the lighting firm?" asked Purbright. Miss Baines gave a small, knowing smile. "Only that they'd overcharged. But I've no doubt that happens everywhere. If you want something done properly in this town, you have to do it yourself." Purbright inclined his head. "Yes, I believe Mr. Cleve tried precisely that." Outside again, the afternoon light was fading into the uncertain grey, peculiar to early spring, a colour halfway between drizzle and doubt. Love shuffled his notebook, frowning over the neat but unsatisfying collection of names and remarks. "So far we've got a missing man, a set of shoes, a light on the green, and talk of a shortage in the funds," he said. "It doesn't quite add up." "It seldom does," Purbright replied, adjusting his hat against the wind. "Not until someone begins to lie, and even then, only slightly." As they turned toward the station, the church bell began its slow toll for evening prayer. The sound drifted across the green, steady and indifferent, as if marking time for lives that preferred not to notice it passing. Purbright walked on in silence, his gaze distant yet attentive, like a man following footprints invisible to anyone else. By the next morning, Flaxborough had settled on its first explanation with the cheerful certainty of a town that preferred tidy conclusions to lingering questions. Mr. Osbert Cleve, the missing treasurer, had clearly taken flight. The sum of £17 and some shillings had vanished from the parish illumination fund, and though that was hardly the sort of fortune one absconds to France over, it was just sufficient to justify a satisfying scandal. Inspector Purbright, reading the morning edition of the Flaxborough Chronicle, found himself gently amused by the headline, "Treasurer's Midnight Flit? Shoes Left Behind." The article quoted an unnamed official source, which he suspected to be none other than Councillor Turnbull, whose zeal for decisive explanations often outpaced the evidence. Sergeant Love entered with the air of a man burdened by paperwork and public opinion alike.
"They're all saying it now, sir."
"Half the town thinks Cleve pinched the collection money and scarpered." Purbright glanced up, expression mild.
"And the other half?"
"Thinks he's done himself in over the shame." "Both halves will be equally wrong," Purbright murmured, folding the paper neatly. "But it will keep them occupied until tea." He rose, coat in hand, and motioned for Love to follow.
Come, Sergeant."
"Let us go and admire the scene of the supposed crime." At the parish office, Councillor Turnbull was already in full oratorical flight, addressing the vicar, Miss Baines, and two bewildered volunteers,
It's very simple, he declared.
The man couldn't face the audit, so he left. Happens in public life all the time. Weak character, you see. Probably on the train to Hull by now. Purbright's arrival caused a brief silence, as if common sense had entered an amateur theatre production mid-performance. He waited politely before speaking. "You believe Mr. Cleeve absconded, councillor?" Turnbull, puffing slightly with importance, nodded.
Undoubtedly.
"The figures don't lie." "Most unfortunate, then," Purbright said mildly, "that the figures seem to have left with him." The councillor faltered. "Well, yes, but the shortfall is undeniable." "How much precisely?" £17 4 and 6. "Not quite a king's ransom," Purbright observed. "Enough for a seaside holiday, perhaps, though hardly a retirement plan." The vicar interjected anxiously. Surely there could be some explanation.
Osbert was scrupulous to a fault, Turnbull snorted.
"Scrupulous people don't disappear in their socks, Reverend." Purbright smiled faintly. "They sometimes do, councillor, particularly if someone else has borrowed their shoes." The room fell momentarily quiet. Miss Baines, at her typewriter, hesitated before continuing her rhythmic clatter. The sound of the keys seemed suddenly intrusive, like gossip overheard. Purbright walked slowly toward the table where the parish accounts lay open. The columns of figures, precise and neatly inked, suggested not deceit but habit, an orderliness too deliberate to conceal chaos. He turned a page, noting a faint indentation of handwriting, as though a note had once been written and removed. He closed the ledger gently. "It might be wise not to announce any conclusions yet, councillor. Missing men have a habit of returning at inconvenient moments." Turnbull gave a dry laugh. "If he does, I hope he brings the £17 with him." Purbright merely nodded, then left without another word. Outside, the morning air was sharp and bright, the green washed pale under thin sunlight.
Love trudged beside him, frowning.
"You don't think Cleeve took it, sir?" "I think," said Purbright, "that people rarely vanish for sums smaller than their dignity." "Then what did he vanish for?" "That," Purbright replied, "depends on who wanted him gone." They reached the edge of the green, where the grass still bore faint impressions of boots and bicycle tires from the previous night's curious onlookers. Purbright paused, gazing toward the vestry. "We'll have a word with Mr. Hobson next," he said. "The lighting contractor's man. If there's one thing that unites crime and parish business, it's the bill." Love flipped open his notebook.
"You think Hobson had something to do with it?"
"I think," Purbright said, "that he was owed a payment, and that missing money may have changed more than one person's evening plans." By noon, they found Hobson at the back of Mason's Electrical, sorting fuses with the care of a man who regarded electricity as a moral issue. He was thin, pale and nervous in that particular way reserved for those who have been honest too long in a dishonest world. "Mr. Hobson," said Purbright pleasantly, "we're told you did the wiring for the parish illumination." "That's right, Inspector. Worked late Thursday till near 10. Left everything neat. Paid up Friday morning except for one invoice. They said Mr. Cleeve would see to that Monday. Did you see him after?" Hobson shook his head quickly. "No, sir." He looked worn out. "Said something about the lights not showing properly on the west side. I told him I'd come back to check, but when I passed the green later there weren't no light to see." Purbright studied him a moment. "No light at all?" "Only one," said Hobson. "A small one near the church wall. Thought it might have been him, but, well, it went out sudden. When they left the shop," Love muttered. "Same light again."
"Everyone's seen it."
"Feels like the whole town's chasing a will-o'-the-wisp." "Perhaps," Purbright said softly. "Because they are." They walked in silence for a while, the cobbles echoing beneath their shoes. Behind them the church clock chimed the hour, steady, untroubled, indifferent. And though nothing in Flaxborough appeared out of place, the inspector had begun to sense that something, or someone, had shifted quietly out of sight, just beyond the town's comfort of explanations. The following dawn arrived damp and uncertain, as if the weather itself were reluctant to commit to the day's story. Mist lay across the parish green in soft bands, blurring the edges of the church railings and muting the gravestones into suggestion rather than form. Sergeant Love stood in the middle of it all, hands in his pockets, looking as though he might apologize to the fog for being there. He was waiting for Inspector Purbright, who appeared presently from the lane, his coat buttoned, his step unhurried as ever. "Morning, Love," he said, surveying the field. "A fine day for seeing very little." Love gave a cautious nod. "That's true enough, sir. But there's something you might want to look at." He pointed to a patch of flattened grass just beyond the vestry door. "Found it when the dew came down. There's a mark here, only one, mind you." Purbright crouched, peering through the thinning mist. A single footprint, faint but clear, pressed into the grass, the right foot, the heel deep, the toe turned slightly outward. Beyond it, nothing, no matching print, no trail, only unbroken blades glistening with dew. "Curious," murmured Purbright. "One foot forward, but not the other." "Couldn't make sense of it myself," Love admitted. "If he stood there, he didn't move. If he walked, he forgot how." Purbright smiled faintly.
Perhaps he was balancing on one leg, Sergeant. A most economical form of exercise, Love chuckled, though uneasily.
"Still, it's odd. It's like whoever it was just stopped existing halfway." Purbright straightened, glancing toward the church. "Existence, Sergeant, is often a matter of location. Let's see where he might have gone, assuming he still had the rest of him." They followed the invisible line the footprint suggested, ending near the low vestry wall. There, beneath a climbing rose, the soil looked faintly disturbed, as though someone had knelt or leaned briefly. Purbright bent close, brushing a few petals aside with his gloved hand.
A small indentation the shape of a square edge lay half hidden. A box?
Love guessed, possibly, Purbright murmured. Or something meant to look like one. A hiding place, perhaps. He looked up, eyes narrowing. Strange thing about concealment, Love. It never quite conceals the desire behind it. They stepped back, letting the morning light gather its strength. The green was beginning to stir. A milk cart clattered past.
A dog barked at nothing, and somewhere beyond the hedges.
Mrs. Glossop was telling her postman that the vicar's wife had a look about her since the shoes were found. "Sir," said Love, lowering his voice, "you think Cleve might have hidden something here?" "Perhaps not Cleve," Purbright replied, "but someone who wished it thought so. A single footprint, a disturbed patch of earth, and shoes left tidily by the door. It all feels rather staged, don't you think?"
Love frowned. "So you reckon someone's made it up?" "Not entirely."
Lies like plays are best when they start from truth. By late morning, the mist had lifted, and Purbright ordered the constables to take photographs and note measurements. Though his tone suggested the exercise was more to please procedure than to illuminate mystery, he himself wandered toward the vicarage, where Reverend Carling was standing beside the gate.
His expression a mixture of fatigue and apprehension. "Inspector," he said, "I do hope you found something that explains this dreadful business. My congregation is growing restless."
"Mrs. Glossop has proposed a special prayer meeting for the return of the righteous." "Let her," said Purbright mildly. "It may be the first useful contribution she's made to the investigation." Carling sighed.
"You don't think he's dead, then?"
"Dead people, Reverend, rarely trouble the bookkeeping." At that, the vicar seemed both relieved and alarmed. "You think he took the money, then?" Purbright smiled slightly.
"I think Mr. Cleve took something with him. Yes, but I doubt it was currency." Leaving the vicar blinking after him, Purbright returned to the station,
where a fresh report awaited. A farmhand had found a leather strap tangled in the hedge at the far side of the green. It was cut clean through, not torn. He examined it thoughtfully. "That might once have belonged to a small case, Love, or perhaps a lamp handle." Love's eyes widened. "The light Mrs. Glossop saw? Possibly the same. If so, whoever carried it wanted both hands free at some point." He paused, tapping the strap against his palm. One footprint.
One light, one man missing. "It's a puzzle made of halves." Love looked puzzled.
Halves, sir? Indeed, Purbright said.
Nothing whole ever vanishes, Sergeant.
Only parts that people choose not to look for. The afternoon wore on quietly, with the sort of calm that in Flaxborough always preceded fresh excitement. By the time the church clock struck 4, Purbright had closed his notebook, though his gaze lingered on the single word scrawled across the last page, footprint. He leaned back, eyes half closed as if listening for something, perhaps a whisper of grass disturbed.
A step unfinished.
In the silence it seemed the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether that missing second footprint might, one day, appear. By the next day, Flaxborough had acquired a faint air of performance, as if the entire town were rehearsing its part in an unfolding drama whose script nobody had seen. Shopkeepers lowered their voices when customers entered. The Green Man's bar filled with low speculation, and even the postmistress took to weighing letters with a solemnity suggesting that envelopes might contain evidence rather than gossip. The mystery of the shoes, the vanished treasurer, and the solitary footprint had become communal property, each retelling more embroidered, each listener more certain. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat at his office window watching sunlight filter through the half-drawn blinds. It was late morning. Outside, the hum of bicycles and delivery carts supplied the gentle rhythm of a town pretending to be busy. He looked not at the street, but at the shifting pattern of light and shade across his desk.
Curious thing, love, he said finally.
The truth, like sunlight, is easiest to miss when one stares at the wrong patch of shadow. Sergeant Love, accustomed to such remarks, made a polite noise of agreement. You're thinking about the footprint again, sir? Among other curiosities, a footprint without a mate, a lamp without a purpose, and a man without shoes. It seems a great deal of absence for one parish to manage. He rose and reached for his hat. We'll pay a call on Mason's Electrical. Mr. Mason himself this time, not poor Hobson. A contractor's books may be dull, but they sometimes hum louder than confession. The shop, occupying a narrow frontage between a tobacconist and a draper's, exuded the smell of metal filings and anxiety. Mr. Mason emerged from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a cloth that had once been white. He greeted the inspector with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Morning, Inspector. Come to pay your bill?" "Not yet, Mr. Mason, though I gather several people may owe you. I understand you supplied the fittings for the illumination evening. That's right. Church committee's regular client of ours."
Fine job too, if I say it myself.
Bit of a muddle this time, though. Accounts not settled, some mix-up with the treasurer. Purbright's expression was mild, but his tone deceptively gentle. "You sent your man Hobson to collect, I believe." Mason hesitated.
I did, thought it better to settle direct.
But Cleve wasn't easy to pin down. Kept saying he'd square it up after Sunday. Funny chap, nervous sort. You don't think he's in trouble, do you? Everyone seems to think so, said Purbright, though opinions differ on what kind. The shopkeeper chuckled uncertainly. Well, whatever it is, I hope he sorts it.
Bad for trade, a disappearance.
People start worrying their own accounts might vanish next. Purbright inclined his head and turned to examine a display of lamps. His gaze lingered on a particular model, a small battery-powered lantern with a leather handle, recently mended where the strap met the casing. "This type sold well?" he asked casually. "Couple of dozen, maybe. Some to the parish, some private." "Why?" Purbright smiled. "Just admiring the workmanship." He laid the lantern down carefully. "I'll trouble you no further, Mr. Mason. You've been most helpful." Back outside, Love frowned.
"That strap, sir, the same as the bit we found by the hedge?"
"Precisely the same."
"And your note recently replaced?"
"Someone's been repairing what shouldn't have been broken." Love rubbed his chin. "So maybe the light Mrs. Glossop saw was from one of these lanterns?"
"But then why cut the strap?"
"Perhaps because it wasn't meant to be found, Sergeant. A broken thing attracts less interest than a whole one." They walked toward the churchyard again, their boots crunching on gravel. Across the green, Miss Baines from the council office was engaged in animated discussion with Councillor Turnbull, her gestures sharp as punctuation. Purbright paused, watching the exchange from a distance.
Observe, love, how civic virtue always prefers the spotlight to the shadow. Miss Baines caught sight of them and approached briskly.
Inspector, I do hope you're making progress. The council's being pestered about the missing funds. Councillor Turnbull insists the police will soon confirm embezzlement. Purbright's expression was almost serene. Does he indeed? How comforting for him to have the future so well informed. She flushed slightly. You mean you don't think it was theft? I try not to think in absolutes, Miss Baines. They so rarely survive inspection. He smiled with faint courtesy. Good morning to you, as she walked away, Love murmured. She didn't like that. Few people do when one moves the lamp from where they've placed it, Purbright replied. The afternoon drifted by under a pale sun. At 4, Purbright and Love returned to the green for a final look before dusk. The single footprint had faded, its edges softened by wind and walkers, yet Purbright studied it as though it still held something unspoken. Funny, sir, Love said quietly. All this fuss over one step. Not fuss, Love, reflection. He glanced at the church windows where light and shadow mingled on the glass like uncertain morality. Someone crossed this green that night with care, enough to make certain we'd notice the shoes, the light, and the absence.
It's theatre, Sergeant, staged with a steady hand and a small conscience. Then we're looking for a performer? A director, Purbright corrected.
And if I'm right, the cast doesn't yet know they're in the play. The bell of St. Swithin's began its even chime, carrying through the cooling air. Purbright stood listening until the final note dissolved into the hush. Then he turned back toward the station, his expression thoughtful, eyes half-shadowed by the falling light. In Flaxborough, evening had returned to its habitual calm, yet beneath its tidy facades something faintly trembled, like a lantern burning low, waiting to flare again. The next evening brought with it a soft, steady rain that blurred the lamps along the high street into dim halos. Most of Flaxborough was indoors by 9 o'clock, some reading, some listening to the wireless, and a good many discussing for the 15th time that week what exactly might have become of poor Mr. Cleeve. The mystery had reached that comfortable stage in small-town scandal where sympathy and satisfaction shared equal footing. At precisely 9:30, Mrs. Cleeve, sitting alone in her parlour with the curtains half-drawn,
saw something that made her teacup tremble against its saucer.
Across the green, in the upper window of St. Swithin's vestry, a light had appeared. Yellow, flickering, distinct. It burned not like electricity but like flame, wavering softly against the rain-smeared glass. For a long moment she stared, unable to move. Then, certain of her sight, she reached for the telephone and, with a hand that shook only slightly, dialed the police station. Inspector Purbright arrived 20 minutes later, his coat glistening with rain, his hat tilted just enough to suggest practicality rather than haste. Sergeant Love followed, carrying a torch and a look of cautious expectation. Mrs. Cleeve greeted them at the door, pale but steady. It was a candle, she said immediately, in the vestry window.
I saw it clear as anything. I thought, it must be him, Inspector. Osbert always said a candle was more respectful than those dreadful bulbs. Purbright nodded gently.
And the light stayed long? Only a few minutes. Then it went out.
Oh, Inspector, it was his window.
The one above his desk. He offered a mild reassurance and motioned Love to fetch the key from the vicar. The churchyard was slick with rain, the grass reflecting the lamps like tarnished silver. The vestry door opened with a damp creak, releasing the smell of cold stone and candle wax. Inside, the air was still, touched faintly by smoke. Love swept the torch beam along the floor and froze. Sir, there! On the small table beneath the window stood a candle, burnt almost to its base, its wax pooled like pale tears on the wood. Beside it lay the parish donation box, half open, with a neat stack of notes inside. Purbright leaned closer, Reappeared, has it? He murmured. Curious sort of conscience, tidy but nocturnal. The money, counted and verified later, matched the missing £17 almost exactly. Yet the box had been locked the previous evening, and no signs of entry marked the door or windows. When they returned to Mrs. Cleeve's house, she looked both relieved and bewildered.
So it's all back, every penny?
Then it wasn't theft at all. Apparently not, Purbright said. But one does wonder why someone would return the money by candlelight instead of daylight. Perhaps Osbert was ashamed, she whispered. Or afraid? Afraid, yes, he said softly. Though of what, we must decide. Later in the station, Love stood beside Purbright as the inspector studied the recovered box.
You think Cleeve brought it back himself?
It's possible, Purbright said, turning the candle stub between his fingers. But the wax was fresh, the wick short, burned only an hour, I'd guess, and Mrs. Cleeve saw the light at 9:30. If he did return it, he'd have needed both access and nerve. Yet his shoes, remember, are still waiting by the vestry door. Love frowned. So someone else could have put the money there to make it look like he did? Someone very much aware of how guilt behaves in public, Purbright replied. People like stories that end neatly. A vanished man, a missing sum, a midnight repentance. How perfectly it fits. Too perfectly, he rose, pacing to the window. Outside, the rain softened into drizzle, the pavements gleaming faintly beneath the street lamps. There's a certain elegance in returning stolen money, he mused. But there's greater safety in letting someone else take credit for the honesty. Love scratched his head. Meaning, sir? Meaning, said Purbright, that whoever placed that candle wished the town to believe Mr. Cleeve was both a thief and a penitent. A complete character arc, as the dramatists say, and nothing pleases Flaxborough more than moral closure, so long as it arrives before bedtime. Love gave a reluctant grin. So you think he's still alive, then? I think, Purbright said, that Mr. Cleeve was a man with more decency than skill at deceit, and that someone, somewhere, has been writing his part in the dark. The next morning, the story of the candle swept through Flaxborough like perfume at a fete. The Chronicle ran the headline, "Lost Treasurer Makes Amends," while Mrs. Glossop was overheard telling her grocer that divine light had been seen manifesting upon the Lord's accounts. By noon, people were debating not the mystery of Cleeve's absence, but the moral of his return. Purbright, reading the paper at his desk, smiled faintly. "Love," he said, "we may yet find our man, but for now, the town has found its parable." Outside, the sun broke briefly through the thinning clouds, casting across the green a pale gleam that touched the vestry window where the candle had burned. For a moment it shimmered, light within glass, reflection within reflection, then faded, as if the town's curiosity itself had drawn the curtains. Inspector Purbright sat quietly at his desk that morning, surveying the orderly sprawl of papers, letters, and blotters with a patience only a long career could cultivate. The candle in the vestry window and the reappearance of the funds had settled the immediate worries of the town, yet he sensed a subtle disturbance beneath the surface, like a shadow shifting behind a drawn curtain. Sergeant Love, leaning against the doorframe, had a frown that suggested he was attempting to piece together a puzzle too delicate for rough handling. "Sir, everyone seems happy now. Shoes, money, light, everything back in place. Is there
anything left for us to do?" Purbright looked up, his eyes tracing the pale sunlight across the parquet floor.
"Ah, Sergeant, there's always something left to do. The trouble with appearances is that they rarely correspond to reality. People act in ways that please the observer rather than express the truth." Love tilted his head. "You mean Cleeve might still be hiding something?" "Possibly," Purbright replied softly. "Or perhaps someone else is using his absence to tidy matters in their own favour. Consider human nature. A man wishes to preserve dignity. A neighbour sees opportunity. In small towns, these motives are seldom complicated, but they are remarkably persistent. He rose, adjusting his coat with the measured grace of a man about to wander through moral terrain rather than streets. "Come along, Sergeant. A stroll might reveal more than a ledger. We shall visit a few people who, by their conduct, hint at what they wish not to say." Their first call was to Mrs. Glossop, whose reputation for observing, indeed embellishing, every incident of note made her both a nuisance and a source of intelligence. She greeted them at her gate, eyebrows arched in anticipation. "Inspector, you'll want to hear all I've seen," she began, clasping her hands tightly. "The light, the shoes, the missing money. It's a scandal, a moral test. I've been thinking of it all night." Purbright nodded politely. "Do go on." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I observed young Mrs. Hobbs tiptoe past the vicarage just as the candle went out. I think she knows more than she admits. And Mrs. Cleeve's expression yesterday, oh, it was peculiar. Neither worried nor relieved. Something else entirely." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, his tone neutral. "And what, may I ask, do you deduce from these subtleties?" She blinked. "That appearances deceive, sir, but so too do silences. People can hide much with a glance, a tone, or the lack of one." "Quite," said Purbright. "And do remember, Mrs. Glossop, that observation must not be confused with conclusion. Many men and women look guilty when they are merely startled." They departed her property, leaving Mrs. Glossop blinking in the sunlight, as if she had been gently reprimanded while being complimented at the same time. Love muttered, "She's tricky, sir." "Tricky indeed," said Purbright, "but often more honest than she seems. Now to the vicarage once more. A man of the cloth often wears both candour and caution, and the gap between them is instructive." Reverend Carling received them, with the habitual hesitancy of one accustomed to walking a tightrope of manners. Purbright asked simple, seemingly trivial questions about the vestry keys, the placement of chairs, and the habits of Mr. Cleeve before the illumination evening. Carling answered with care, occasionally glancing at the window as though to measure the sincerity of his responses by the light falling across the floor. "It's a strange thing," Purbright remarked gently, "how a man may appear diligent, devoted even, yet leave a small puzzle for others to notice." "Yes, sir," said Carling. "Osbert was always thorough, perhaps too much so. One notices it only when something seems missing." "Exactly," Purbright replied. "And missing in this case is often a matter of perspective rather than substance." They left the vicarage in silence, the soft clatter of rain against the roof adding a rhythm to reflection. Love as seen. Notebook remained open but untouched, as though even he recognized the futility of recording what could only be intuited. Purbright's eyes lingered on the green ahead, where the shadows of lamp-posts stretched long across the damp grass. "Appearances, Sergeant, are a necessary illusion. They allow people to continue with dignity while the truth sorts itself out beneath their notice. Our task is to watch quietly and wait for the inconsistencies to speak." Love nodded slowly, understanding at last that in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, crime and discretion rarely announce themselves together. Sometimes, he realized, the smallest gestures, the tilt of a hat, a glance, a delayed step, were louder than any confession or complaint. As they returned to the station, Purbright glanced back toward the vestry, where the faint outline of the candle's previous glow lingered in memory. "In the matter of appearances, Sergeant, one must remember that the most illuminating details are rarely those in full view. That evening, Flaxborough was unusually quiet, as though the rain earlier had washed away not only dust, but gossip. Inspector Purbright had suggested a walk along the parish green, ostensibly to check the lamps and paths, though Love suspected there was a more deliberate purpose. A small lantern hung from Purbright's hand, its light steady and modest, throwing long shadows over the dew-darkened grass. They began near the vestry where the shoes had first been found, and moved slowly toward the church wall. The lantern cast pools of soft illumination, revealing patches of wet leaves and flattened grass, each telling a story that most townsfolk would never notice. "It's best to observe under these conditions, Sergeant," Purbright said quietly, his gaze scanning every shadow. "People act differently in dim light than they do under scrutiny." Love followed closely, noting the stillness of the night.
You mean the guilty reveal themselves? Not always the guilty, Purbright replied. Sometimes it is the cautious, or even the anxious, whose behavior tells more than words. A figure emerged from the mist, a townsperson taking a late stroll along the path beside the green.
Purbright inclined his head politely, acknowledging the presence without comment. The individual hesitated, then turned quickly toward the lane, walking with a briskness that suggested discomfort. "Observe, Love," Purbright murmured. "The manner of movement often speaks louder than speech." They continued, the lantern casting a golden circle over the damp grass, and soon encountered another shadow near the church gate. This one paused, then dropped a small object into the hedge before hurrying away. Purbright bent, retrieving it carefully. A thin leather strap cut cleanly at one end. "Same as before," he said, examining the piece in the lantern's glow. "Someone has been carrying tools or props and discarded them with care." Love frowned. "So we're looking for someone handling these things at night?" Purbright's expression remained composed. "We are observing how the pieces move in the absence of their owner. Often the manipulator is more revealing than the man assumed missing." They reached the far end of the green, where the church bells began their evening chime. The sound echoed across the wet grass and the empty streets, carrying a rhythm that seemed to measure human hesitation. Purbright stood still, lantern raised, letting the light fall over every detail of the scene, the footprints fading into grass, the small mound where the candle had burned, and the neatly arranged shoes at the vestry door. "Notice, Sergeant," Purbright said softly, "how each element is placed to suggest intention. The placement of objects, the timing of light, even the absence of a second footprint. It is theatre, carefully rehearsed, yet performed without an audience." Love nodded slowly. "So tonight we're catching the performance in action?" "Not quite," Purbright said, lowering the lantern. "We are noting the cues. Those who stage a scene always reveal themselves in gesture, in pause, in the smallest hesitation." As they walked back toward the station, Purbright glanced at the townhouses lining the high street. Windows glowed warmly, curtains drawn, the inhabitants oblivious to the quiet drama they passed each night. He spoke without looking at Love. "One day soon, Sergeant, someone will give themselves away not by words, but by the manners in which they respond to what they believe is unobserved." Love exhaled, feeling the weight of the night. "And
Until then we just watch?" "Precisely," said Purbright, his eyes catching the lantern light one last time before he set it aside.
patience is the greatest ally. Footsteps, gestures, small lights, they are the whispers of truth. All we need do is listen." The town remained silent as they returned, the green empty but for the shadows, the lantern's glow extinguished, leaving only memory and the faint promise of revelation. The next morning, Flaxborough resumed its habitual rhythm, though a faint undercurrent of curiosity lingered in the streets like mist over the parish green. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with careful hands, and even the postman moved a little slower, as though each step might reveal a secret. Yet To the casual observer, nothing had changed. The shoes remained by the vestry, the candle stub rested quietly, and Mr. Cleeve's presence was felt more as an absence than a fact. Inspector Purbright arrived at the green in mid-morning, accompanied by Sergeant Love. The dew had faded, leaving the grass glistening in the weak sunlight, footprints half erased, shadows softening against stone and shrubbery. Purbright paused at the vestry, examining the shoes with mild attention. "Careful placement," he murmured, "suggests intention. Someone wished us to see them exactly as they are." Love shifted uneasily. "So the man hasn't vanished entirely?" "Only partially," Purbright replied. "It is remarkable what a single pair of shoes, a light, and a footprint can imply when observed by eager minds." They walked slowly along the path, Purbright pausing occasionally to bend close to the earth. He inspected the grass near the candle's former position, noting the faint impression of a heel. "Footsteps," he said softly. "Tell more than statements, Sergeant. Each one is a question posed, and often the answer is in the hesitation between steps." From the far side of the green, a figure approached. Mr. Hobson, the dismissed clerk of the lighting firm. He carried himself with a nervous precision, hands tucked into coat pockets, eyes flitting from the path to the shadows. Purbright nodded politely. "Good morning, Mr. Hobson. Fine day to reflect on the nature of light, isn't it?" Hobson swallowed. "Yes, sir."
I just wanted to check the lamps, make sure everything's working.
"Nothing more." "Indeed," said Purbright. "And yet even in observation one can reveal much without speaking. Notice, Sergeant, the careful pacing, the avoidance of the centre of the green. Subtle clues in conduct, far more telling than words." Hobson's gaze flicked to the shoes and the patch of disturbed grass. His lips parted, but no sound came. Purbright's eyes softened with faint amusement. "A polite evening walk," he said, "offers one the chance to see how shadows behave, and how people react to them." The young man nodded, uneasy, and continued along the perimeter, never stepping closer than necessary. Purbright turned to Love. "Do you see, Sergeant? Fear or caution reveals itself in posture, in glance, in the hesitation before a stride. One does not need confession when one observes closely." Love scribbled notes, the rhythm of his pencil a subdued echo of the subtle motions around them. "So tonight, sir, we might finally know who's been moving about."
"Not necessarily," Purbright said, his voice calm.
"Observation is about patience. The guilty, or those who manipulate, will speak in deeds long before words are offered. It is the quiet theatre of human nature." They walked back toward the station, shadows falling long as the sun edged toward noon. Purbright glanced at the green, now empty of both man and mystery, and murmured, "Footsteps and shadows, Sergeant, are the oldest witnesses. They do not tire, they do not lie. We merely need the patience to read them." Love, glancing back once more at the vestry, nodded, sensing the weight of what had been observed. For the first time, he felt that the puzzle was less a matter of lost money or missing shoes than of human intention, subtle and concealed, awaiting the final, deliberate revelation. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had resumed its habitual pace, though the air still carried the faint tension of an unresolved story. Shops opened promptly, the postman delivered letters with his usual precision, and the green lay empty, washed in pale sunlight that made the dew-damp grass shimmer like silver thread. Yet for those with eyes to notice, the town bore subtle traces of change, gestures more cautious, glances more measured, and the faint hum of curiosity that refused to vanish entirely. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk with a cup of tea steaming gently beside him, surveyed the neat arrangement of ledgers, notes, and photographs. Sergeant Love, perched on the edge of a chair with a notebook in hand, looked toward the window, catching occasional glimpses of the vestry where the shoes still waited. "It seems, Sergeant, that life proceeds as though nothing has happened," Purbright observed, stirring the tea idly. yet appearances are rarely more than invitations to notice more closely. Love nodded, unsure whether to respond as a constable or as an apprentice in human observation. "Do you think the town suspects anything now, sir?" "People suspect always, but only in the particulars that serve them," Purbright said, setting down the spoon. "They prefer neat conclusions, though the truth often lies behind subtle gestures and small disturbances. Observe, for example, the placement of those shoes. Carefully aligned, neither careless nor frantic. A message, though of what, is not immediately clear." They rose together, and Purbright suggested a stroll to the green.
Ostensibly to enjoy the morning sun, but in reality to witness the town's quiet rhythms.
Along the path, the parish bell tolled 11 times, each note falling across the grass like measured punctuation. Pedestrians paused politely, acknowledging its rhythm without remark, as if it were a reminder that life continued despite small disruptions. Mrs. Glossop appeared near the church gate, carrying a basket and glancing at the vestry. Her expression blended curiosity and triumph, suggesting that she had anticipated the inspector's arrival. "Good morning, Inspector," she said crisply. "I trust the matter is drawing to a close." Purbright inclined his head with his usual civility. "Indeed, Mrs. Glossop, the final scene is often the quietest, though by no means the least revealing." She nodded, satisfied, and moved on, murmuring something about divine providence and the morality of observation. Love scribbled a note, but Purbright waved it aside. "The lesson here, Sergeant, is not in writing but in watching. Every gesture, every hesitation, every glance is a word in the unspoken narrative." They continued across the green toward the vestry steps where the candle stub rested, still faintly warm in memory. Purbright crouched, examining the shoes and surrounding grass with measured attention. "One might think this stage complete," he said softly. "Yet there are always shadows that persist, footprints that vanish too soon, lights that flicker unexpectedly. It is in those details that the human story is told." Love looked puzzled. "So we just wait, sir?" "Wait and observe," Purbright said. "Everything and everyone reveals themselves in time. A careful question, a polite remark, or even the quiet persistence of a lantern's glow. These are the instruments of discovery. And sometimes, Sergeant, the resolution is delivered not with noise or confession, but with civility, patience, and a single, well-timed observation." As they returned to the station, the green stretched quietly behind them, ordered, tidy, and unchanged save for the lingering impression of footsteps, shadows, and small disturbances. Purbright poured himself another cup of tea, setting it beside a plate of biscuits. Love seated himself again, notebook closed, feeling the subtle weight of the day's lesson settle like dust on a window ledge. Outside, the parish bell tolled once more, gentle and final, marking not an ending, but the quiet continuation of ordinary life. Within the station, the inspector allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The town had resumed its routines, yet beneath its calm, the small disturbances of human nature persisted, ready to speak to those with the patience and attention to notice. Purbright, for his part, returned to his paperwork with the steady certainty of a man who knew that the town's quiet truths would eventually present themselves precisely when they were meant to do so.